Friends, if everybody could take their seats, we'll be ready to start in just a few moments. I am very glad to hear that everybody's happy and joyful on what day is it today? Wednesday. Public holidays throw me out. Wednesday morning. Even you, the Attorney General, may have to take a seat up the front if there's still one. You might have to go over here. Just give us one quick moment. We have apparently some AV issues. Have they been resolved? They're all good. Oh, that's what I like. Well, thank you everybody for arriving this morning and being so prompt. My name is Tim Wilson and I'm Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here this morning at the Australian Human Rights Commission in our salubrious Level 3 meeting room. I'd like to, of course, begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today and pay acknowledgement to their elders past and present, and the enduring cultural connection they have to the land in which we meet. I realise that in the room there are so many people, esteemed people from community organisations and lobby groups and the like, and so I can't list everybody, but for official purposes, of course, I'd like to acknowledge the Attorney General, Senator George Brandis, for being here with us this morning. Senator Janet Rice, I understand, is with her, though I haven't seen her. Oh, sorry, there you are. Sorry, right in front. There you go. That shows how hopeless I am. Senator Claire Moore, Shadow Minister for Women, Carers and Communities. Of course, my colleague, Professor Gillian Triggs, the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission. Susan Ryan, up the front, the Age and Disability Discrimination Commissioner. Dr. Tim Parmesan, the Race Discrimination Commissioner. I haven't seen her yet, but I understand she's also trying to make it here. Elizabeth Broderick, the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, and also joined by two important state members of Parliament, and I'll confess, who are also my very good friends. So it shows you that it's nice when your friends turn up to support you from time to time. The independent member for Sydney, Mr. Alex Greenwich, and the Liberal member for the state seat of Coogee, Bruce Notley-Smith. I'd like to welcome everybody again for coming this morning to the launch of the report Resilient Individuals, which follows on from the sexual orientation, gender identity and intersex rights national consultation we held throughout the second half of last year and early this year. As many of you will know, and I've said it before, the Australian Human Rights Commission Act establishes a structure where there are commissioners responsible for age, sex, disability and race discrimination, for the Children's Commissioner and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, as well as the Human Rights Commissioner and the President. In the past, structurally, the Commission has not had somebody whose sole purpose has been to focus on the issues that exist in the area of sexual orientation, gender identity and intersex status issues. And I think they're enormously important issues that need to be addressed, at least because when you look at the other structures of government, you often have ministers, departments or agencies, as well as commissioners responsible for these issues to deal with historical issues of injustice or issues about rights. But with the absence of ministers specifically focusing on these issues, or government agencies or commissioners, too often the issues that affect people on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity and intersex status issues can fall through the cracks of government policy. So that is one of the key reasons why I have taken on the role as de facto Commissioner in this space, but equally because it fits so neatly as Human Rights Commissioner when we want to achieve the basic principles of equality before the law and equal treatment by government, which is entirely consistent with my role as Human Rights Commissioner. I'll give, of course, a lot more details on the report after the Attorney General has officially launched it. But the point of the report actually came out of the view and the need that, irrespective of the debate around marriage and legislation around that and where that was going, that we couldn't let it become the all-consuming subject matter that affected people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender or intersex. There were plenty of other issues that needed to be addressed, whether through law, policy, practice and regulation that exist across Australia that need a lot more visibility and attention. And so the point of the consultation and the point of this report is to give life to that discussion and those issues so that we can seek to prosecute change, to improve the day-to-day living of LGBTI Australians. But before I give much more detail about what the report covers, and also what we recommend, I will, of course, welcome the Commonwealth Attorney General, George Brandis, to the stage to officially launch the report.
Well, Tim, thank you very much indeed. And may I begin as well by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, members of the Human Rights Commission, parliamentary colleagues. I see my friend Senator Claire Moore from Queensland over there, and Senator Janet Rice from the Australian Greens is here as well. The fact that this report is being launched by a Liberal Attorney General at a function supported by Labor and indeed Greens senators underlies about as well as anything could, I think, the cross-party nature of support for removal of discrimination against people on the basis of sexuality and gender identity. And it's a great pleasure, therefore, to launch this report. The report contains a number of recommendations. Recommendation 1 is in relation to the definition of marriage, which, as you know, is not the policy of the government. But nevertheless, as Tim has said, the recommendations of the report also remind us that although there has been much discussion in recent months about the definition of marriage, the question of discrimination is much, much wider than that. There are issues that arise largely at the state and territory level, which are identified and addressed by this report. One topic that is addressed by the report that I think is particularly important is the question of violence against people on the basis of their sexual orientation, and in particular, violence against young people. The report reminds us, not that we needed to be reminded, about how wicked it is, to taunt, to embarrass, to abuse, to humiliate young people because of their sexuality or their sexual orientation. That is one of many of the areas that still need urgently to be addressed by our governments at state and federal level, and which this report highlights. I want to congratulate Tim Wilson on the work that he has done in preparing this report. It seems barely conceivable that when 18 months ago I announced that Tim Wilson was going to be appointed as the Human Rights Commissioner, there was controversy about it. And there were certain people from certain points of view who thought that this was an inappropriate choice because Tim comes from, as he proudly says, a classically liberal background. Everything that Tim Wilson has done in the 18 months since he's been the Human Rights Commissioner has demonstrated how good a choice he was. In fact, the great Noel Pearson was kind enough to describe it in a column in The Australian only a couple of weeks ago as a masterstroke. Well, Tim, that was a compliment for you, not for me. But Tim does approach human rights issues in the way that I believe that they ought to be approached, from the perspective of somebody who speaks in the classic liberal tradition. When we talk about the issue of sexuality and gender identity, I can't help being reminded of John Stuart Mill's remark when On Liberty he wrote of individuals over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. That classically liberal sentiment inspires people like Tim Wilson, it inspires people like me. I hope it inspires all of us, regardless of our different political perspectives. And it represents the core insight, the philosophy that underlies this report. Indeed, it was no less a liberal philosopher than Jeremy Bentham, in an unpublished essay in the late 1700s, who was the first person that we know of to present an argument for homosexual law reform in England. So the values that underlie this report, come from the core of the liberal tradition. And I want to congratulate you, Tim, in blending that tradition with these practical conclusions, and in doing so, highlighting an area of which still needs to be addressed, as I said a moment ago, still needs it to be addressed, still calls out for urgent law reform at both the state and the Commonwealth level. So, ladies and gentlemen, with those words, let me launch this report, Resilient Individuals, Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Intersex Rights, to congratulate the Human Rights Commission, and in particular to congratulate the Human Rights Commissioner, Tim Wilson, for a fine body of work, which I'm sure will inspire much needed law reform. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Attorney General, for two things. Firstly, for those very kind words about the work of the Commission, of myself, and I think it needs to be extended, and I'll say this later, but also to my Commission colleagues who very much contributed to the development and writing of this report, but also for enlightening me on the contribution of Jeremy Bentham. Bentham actually comes up regularly in my discussions around rights and what they mean, particularly in terms of the Australian political tradition, and I was not aware that he had made that argument, so I am going to have to mine you for the reference because it will be added to my repertoire into the future on that discussion. In the past 30 years, we've of course made great strides as a society to ensure that people are treated equally regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. But there is of course much more work that needs to be done. Since the middle of last year, the Australian Human Rights Commission ran a nationwide consultation on the issues that affect people on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity and intersex status. The objective of the consultation was to identify where the liberal human rights principles of equality before the law and government is not being met for LGBTI Australians. Unsurprisingly, the most common theme in the report, well, from the consultations that delivered the report, Resilient Individuals, was where the government should allow same-sex couples to marry. And I need to point out that that was across the board, no matter where we were in the country, from both heterosexual people and homosexual people. And I know that even when I was being charged in Charters Towers for being a conservative on the issue by the local deputy mayor in outback Queensland, that perhaps sentiment really had changed on people's attitudes towards these issues. But the primary objective of completing the consultation was actually to give a voice to the issues outside of marriage. It was to raise the profile of the issues that affect people on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or intersex status, which perhaps sometimes have been consumed by the debate around marriage and which can have a very pragmatic impact on people's day-to-day lives and can be much more easily addressed and should not be ignored. Now, that isn't to say that marriage isn't an important part of the reform. It is, and we make recommendations explicitly on that. But it does not sit in isolation. While the federal parliament continues to debate this area of law reform, we should not be sitting idle in addressing the other important issues that affect people based on their sexual orientation and gender identity or intersex status. And I know that Alex Greenwich and Bruce Notley-Smith, for instance, in the last New South Wales Parliament, worked specifically to address the issue around expungement of past crimes for homosexual acts. That is a very good example of something that can be advanced, that is non-controversial, but does something very significant for people in their day-to-day lives. Throughout the consultations, we travelled across the country and heard stories of the lived experiences of people on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity and intersex status. I'll refer to it as SOGII from now on to make it easier. We went to places ranging from Fitzroy Crossing and Broome through to Cairns, Melbourne, Hobart, Shepparton, Singleton, Sydney, Adelaide, Perth, Kalgoorlie, Charters Towers and Alice Springs, as well as Townsville and Brisbane. We got across the country and tried to make sure not just that we heard the stories from people in capital cities where there are organised groups, but also to go and speak to people who perhaps don't ordinarily have a voice, and also to make sure that the perspectives of rural, regional and remote communities were heard in this discussion, because they often face very direct and very nuanced issues in comparison to those of us in the cities. We also ran an online survey process to get a self-reported read on the human rights stories that sit behind the issues that we raised. In the survey, we asked LGBTI Australians to describe their ideal inclusive Australia. Now, their aspirations were shockingly simple, and you can read them on page 10. One person said that they simply wanted equality at all levels, that there are no special rules for minorities, but neither should there be any persecutions for people's preferences, whatever they may be. Another said they simply wanted Australia to be a place where it is unremarkable to be LGBTI. Other people said that if people obey the laws of this country, then the law should protect everyone equally and apply to everybody equally. Simply the same law for everyone. One person said that they wanted an Australia where sexuality, gender identity and intersex status are not seen as significant, that it is where it is not an issue, and people are given the universal and inalienable rights of freedom of expression, speech, association and identity. Another person argued that people's gender identity should be respected and understood, that correct pronouns should be used, no barriers to employment services should exist, and that intersex children are not surgically forced into a male or female gender. Tragically, too much of the stories we heard, whether it was in a survey or in a personal capacity, came from direct consequences of people fearing discrimination in different aspects of their life. One person's simple aspiration is that they wanted to be able to go outside, participate in sport and have employment without discrimination. Holding hands was actually a very common theme which showed the importance of love in this discussion, but the fact that some people simply want an Australia where two men can hold hands going down the street without people gawking or without people even thinking it is a political statement or without people thinking it is inappropriate. I think we would all agree they are pretty simple aspirations for a more inclusive Australia. Thematically, what we heard was that while there had been progress on many of the issues that affect LGBTI people, that many still lacked visibility because of the legacy of state-sanctioned discrimination in the past and going on into the future. Not all discrimination is equal. Interpersonal discrimination occurs between individuals and is often legal and an exercise of people's freedom, even if it sometimes is deemed to be unjust. Whereas institutional discrimination occurs when systems such as health and education do not treat everyone equally. Structural discrimination principally occurs when government and law discriminate and is a fundamental breach of people's human rights and equality before the law. Addressing structural discrimination is essential because it licenses other types of discrimination within society, and we should not be afraid of saying that. It was only a little over 30 years ago that Australian states decriminalised homosexual acts between consenting adults. And it was only about 40 years ago that the federal parliament moved a resolution calling on the states to do so, led by John Gorton. It has only been in the last 2 decades that government has ensured people are not discriminated against in accessing government services and government employment, as well as many issues outside in the private marketplace on the basis of people's SOGII. Visibility of the issues that people face will not be visible so long as the law and government stigmatise people simply for being themselves. And we have been on a long process since the decriminalisation 30 years ago to start to address that and raise the profile. But there is a long way to go because there is a legacy that exists from state-sanctioned discrimination. Because government in the past and continues to do today and has legitimised and fostered many of these problems because of discrimination. They also have a responsibility to fix them. This report catalogues the long list of recommendations to address the legacy of past state-sanctioned discrimination and how it has led to the suppression of addressing the issues that impact on LGBTI Australians. One of the most straightforward is to address the mixed bag of anti-discrimination laws that operate across the states and the Commonwealth. The inconsistency of the laws do not reflect malice on the part of parliaments. They merely reflect the time that the laws were passed. For example, the New South Wales law protects people from discrimination on the basis of homosexuality, but not if somebody happens to be bisexual. That's a rather simple observation, could be easily addressed if laws were made more consistent with the Commonwealth standard under the Sex Discrimination Act around the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity or intersex status issues. Many states also don't cover gender identity or intersex status. It would be a very simple, straightforward, and easy reform to be made to make sure that anti-discrimination laws were more inclusive of everybody. In addition to these stories that we collected from qualitative evidence, we also surveyed for quantitative data of issues affecting LGBTI Australians. I wish I could say the data surprised us, but that was not the case. The reality is the data sets reflected many other data sets collected by universities and health bodies. According to the survey data we collected, more than 70% reported that they'd experienced bullying, harassment, or some form of violence. Of that 70%, 88% was on the basis of people's sexual orientation, 26% on gender identity, and 2% on intersex status. Similarly, nearly 45% claimed that they'd been excluded from some form of social participation, and nearly 25% had reported they'd been refused access to some form of public service. Other simple measures can also be taken to assist people on the basis of their gender identity, which need to be addressed. In line with the High Court decision in this area, all states and territories should legislate to require that a self-identified legal declaration, such as a statutory declaration, is sufficient proof to change a person's gender identity for the purpose of government records and proof of identity documentation. We made many other recommendations to address these issues, such as significant issues in criminal matters. For instance, we can claim our own first victory. In the time between we sent this report off to the printer and which it has received, Victoria completed its full repeal of Section 19 of the Crimes Act in 1958 that created a dedicated criminal provision for HIV. Snaps to Victoria, but we hope other states will follow suit. Another recommendation is that in the interest of promoting public health and ensuring testing for sexually transmitted infections, bloodborne viruses and HIV, that Queensland should amend its age of consent laws to ensure the equal treatment of teenage gay males. The practical reality is when we were in Queensland talking to health groups and sexual health centres, it was abundantly clear that the unequal age of consent led to young gay men not testing for simple sexually transmitted infections, bloodborne viruses or HIV, because they would have to admit that they had engaged in a conduct which was outside of the law. Similarly, there is a very serious need for the Australian Capital Territory, Northern Territory, Queensland, Tasmania and Western Australia to legislate to expunge past criminal records of historic consensual homosexual act offences and follow the lead of Victoria and New South Wales. We also strongly believe that Western Australia and the Northern Territory should commit to schemes that expunge the criminal records of historical consensual homosexual offences, and that the ACT, Queensland and Tasmania implement intended schemes to expunge these criminal records, and that South Australia should develop an implementation process following its introduction of legislation to expunge these records. There are many other issues at a state level as well. Queensland and South Australia should legislate to abolish the homosexual advanced defence, and I welcome the fact that both states are broadly in favour of doing so. Let's just make it happen. But there are a lot of issues that sit outside of law and they need to be worked across different levels of government jurisdiction. All states and territories should be working to develop and implement policies on the placement of trans and gender diverse prisoners in correctional services and for access to hormone therapy to be based on medically identified need and not simply discretion. The establishment of a trans-specific policy stream across the health system to ensure that trans people do not face bureaucratic barriers to accessing basic healthcare services. We also strongly recommend that that states and the Commonwealth implement the recommendations of the Australian Senate Community Affairs Committee's 2014 on the involuntary or coerced sterilisation of intersex people in Australia. As the Attorney-General outlined, one of the most basic principles of human rights sits behind bodily autonomy and people's right to own their own bodies and be able to live their lives as they see fit. The idea that somebody can be coerced or sterilised or involuntary sterilising simply because of who they are and how they are born is a fundamental breach of that basic principle of bodily autonomy and should be addressed. There are many other recommendations which you can read as you go through the report. But what I would say, and it's very important to highlight, is that no recommendations from the report are encouraging a new specific set of group rights or special legal privileges for people simply because of who they are. All the recommendations simply request that LGBTI Australians be treated equally by government and the law. And that is a very simple aspiration for what we should want for our society. As I said at the start, these reports don't come out of thin air. They follow a large and long process of consultation that involved us travelling all around the country and listening to human stories. It'd be impossible to thank for everybody who's made contributions and made their input into this process. But I'd like to thank every group that came to meetings we organised, in community consultations in different parts of the country, and equally to those people who made submissions to the online survey and provided their feedback. In particular, of course, I want to thank the staff at the Australian Human Rights Commission that made this possible and made the process of me catching planes and getting around the country as seamless as possible. Of course, the lead author of the report is Siri May, and I want to thank her specifically for her contribution and bringing it all together and supporting me throughout the process. But equally, I want to thank the other significant staff at the Australian Human Rights Commission who have made their contributions to the development of this report, including Louise Bygrave and Simone Guigueras, who's at the back here, I see, who no longer worked for the Commission, but I'm very glad to see you here today, as well as Holly Ritson, who has continued to support us in the final days of this report. But equally, the other staff who have contributed to its development and those arduous processes of proofing it at every step of the way, in particular Helen Potts and Darren Dick and Akil, who have made their contributions, and Angela Jores, who has also assisted with the launch of today's event. As I said before, the importance of this report is to give visibility to the issues that have not been addressed at a state and a Commonwealth level, and also address issues of procedure and process. Many of the recommendations are for governments to take action. The Australian Human Rights Commission will also be taking action out of this report, and we've listed it on page 4, explicitly the work that we are going to do. To look at how into the future we're going to work with universities, vocational education providers and professional bodies, such as medical and teaching associations, to undertake an audit of the inclusion of SOGII issues in the health and education fields. This audit will identify existing resources where gaps remain and how best to develop necessary resources to improve addressing issues related to SOGII. We will also review the evidence base on the experiences of transgender, diverse and intersex people in sporting matters and engage in a policy process to promote better inclusion in sports practices. We will also engage into the future research that directly addresses issues around unconscious bias against LGBTI people in the health sector, the experiences of discrimination by intersex people, and specifically the specialist clinical service provision needs of trans and gender diverse people, as just some examples, as well as continuing the important work we're doing in terms of sporting and working with the Pride and Sport Index and the wonderful people at the Australian Sports Commission. Because these policy proposals and the work that we recommend for government will have obviously an impact on the people it directly affect, but we think will promote a more inclusive Australia for people regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity. Thank you everybody for coming, and I'm glad to say the report is officially launched. We're happy to take questions if you've got any questions, or we actually have a microphone. Holly.
Yes.
Or if everybody's relaxed and comfortable on a cool Wednesday rainy morning. Look, I love it when a whole bunch of people turn up and they all just accept everything I've said without any qualification. Ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else, thank you very much for coming this morning, and I'm more than happy to chat if you have any other issues you want to raise. Thank you.